So success doesn't depend upon exactness. Okay? Whereas something that's complicated, it follows rules and laws. And those rules and laws have to be followed exactly.
I'm here with Dr. Rick Nason. Rick, how are you doing?
I'm doing great today. How are you, Roger?
I discovered you following a thread. So you're at the end of the thread that I started. It started with Arthur Brooks mentioning the difference between complex and complicated. He's a professor and wrote Strength to Strength. And then I took some advice from a friend of mine, Michael Euster, who wrote two really good books, Comfort Crisis and Scarcity Brain. And one of his mantras, because he's a journalist by trade, was always ask the Pope. And it was a story of an assignment he had of how much does, when he was young, how much does the Pope make? His editor gave this to him and some other ones. And they all went around asking, the church and everything else. And they went back and it's like, well, it's really hard to discover. We asked all these people and they're like, why didn't you just go to the Vatican? Just go to the source. And when I was looking up the source of complicated versus complex, I found a lot of articles, but they all referenced your book. It's not complicated. Well, let's have a chat. And so you and I connected. So I appreciate your generosity in that.
Are you comparing me to the Pope? I'm a Protestant.
Well, we won't go there, but we will go into this concept of complicated versus complex. I wanted to explore this. And the reason I was pulling this thread was to see how it relates to managing retirement planning over 30-year periods with lots of inputs that interact. So that was my purpose. Why don't we start with, can we define, I guess there's three types of problems: simple, complicated, and complex. Why don't we just start with defining what those are and why that's important?
Sure. Just to back up a little bit, there's actually all types of systems, but the three main ones are simple, complicated, and complex. A simple system, just to use an example, I'll steal from my book, is making coffee. And here I'm talking about an old style coffee pot. And, for example, you might join a new company, you walk into the coffee room, you see the coffee pot's empty, and you can more or less figure out by, opening up the cupboard door, you can see the instructions for making the coffee and get it done. But here's the thing: is the simple system is you can basically use a recipe, but it's also robust, and this is kind of key. So if you add a little bit too much coffee, guess what? It's still going to come out like coffee. If you put a little bit too much cream in your coffee, you're probably still going to drink it. So success doesn't depend upon exactness. Okay. Whereas something that's complicated, it follows rules and laws, and those rules and laws have to be followed exactly. So again, to take an example from my book, albeit a very simplistic example, is accounting. If you have two accountants who have the same financial data, they should come up with the same data for the company. And if they don't, one of them's probably going to jail, or potentially, going to jail for accounting fraud. And then you get complex, which again, stealing from my book, and I want to give a second example here, is like a sales call. There is no recipe for a successful sales call. Actually, there's really no way to define success. Is selling 10 units a success? Or is selling 1,000 units a success? Is even getting invited back to make a presentation success? You can't even really define success. And we've all had those robo sales calls. We all know how successful they are. So obviously following a recipe doesn't work. Now, here's the irony, is virtually everyone except in finance considers the ultimate example of a complex system to be the financial markets, particularly the stock market. So when biologists talk about complexity, they talk about the stock market. When, anthropologists talk about complexity, they use the stock market as an example. Just real quick, just for completeness sake, there are lots of other types of systems. For example, a chaotic system, which is, again, systems theorists were uh, incredibly poor at marketing. So all these terms have different meanings from layperson's view. So a chaos system is something that is completely 100% predictable, but actually looks like it's random. A very famous example of this is weather systems, the models for weather systems, which is kind of relevant for those of you on the climate debate. Most weather systems are incredibly sensitive to initial conditions. And you've probably heard of the butterfly flapping its wings. That, a butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon changes the weather in New York. That actually comes from the chaotic nature of all of the vast majority of our climate models. And so if you change the initial conditions ever so slightly, you get a dramatically different result. And then, of course, we have wicked systems, which are systems which basically don't have a solution. The classic example that they give to self-driving cars, do you kill yourself? If you're going to have an accident, do you kill yourself or do you kill the person on the sidewalk type no-win, darned if you do, darned if you don't situation. And there's others as well. But hopefully that gives a quick background.
This is very complex, the number of different types of
complex or complicated. The main one that people need to be concerned about is complicated or complex. Because first off,
let me ask you a question before we go there. And so these definitions, and this is systems thinking, is my understanding. And this is not something new. This is a delineation that scientists and people have made for a long time of what am I dealing with, right?
Yeah. A lot of these concepts go back. We have science. Having said that, it's kind of became formalized in what we now call a science in the 70s. And, of course, the onset of computers has really accelerated this and made a need for a clear distinction between complicated and complex, even more so now with AI.
Yeah, which is a whole nother layer that I wanted to ask about. Why is it important to identify, let's stick with those three. Why is it important to identify which one we're dealing with?
It's important to identify because, through our schooling, through our education, I'm a university prof, I'm a former, derivatives trader, all highly trained, all the right certificates, yada, yada, yada. We've been trained to think complicated, okay? Every time you took a multiple choice test, you were being validated on your ability to think in a complicated fashion. The reality is that most of the major issues facing the world today are complex. And if you try to solve a complex problem with our tools of complicated thinking, almost always you will make the situation worse.
Worse, not just not solve it, but worse.
Worse. Not only will you not solve it, and by the way,
why would that be?
That's a whole other discussion because we have to learn to think in terms of manage, not solve. But you generally make it far worse.
And that's the key differential is one you can solve, complicated. I was telling you beforehand, I just completed this Lego typewriter with 2,079 pieces. You said it was simple when I mentioned it, but you're advanced on this thinking. But it took me a long time to do this. And many times I followed the rules, the algorithm. And when I didn't, I had to go back and undo it to get back to right.
By the way, I should point out that something that is simple can be very difficult to do. And something that's complicated can actually be quite trivial to do. But I'm more of a mechano man. I don't know if you can see my robot in the background or not, but I think it's out of camera view at the moment. But I'm more of a mechano than a Lego person. But we digress.
So it's important to identify complicated versus complex because from a systems standpoint, how you approach the problem is totally different, I would assume, or very different.
How you approach the problem, your mental attitude towards the problem. This is particularly appropriate for financial planning. Thinking that you can solve your retirement planning problems or your financial planning problems is not a healthy way to go about it, in my opinion. But also, it show, I'll give you a stat that I'm sure that that you might not want to publicize, but uh, we know that the more educated the financial expert, the worse their projections are. So, for example, another clear example of this is 75% of mutual funds underperform, the proverbial monkeys throwing darts at the stock pages over a 5-year period. This is what we know. So, obviously, it's not the higher education, the certifications necessarily that count. It's understanding that you have to manage something, not solve it. It's understanding that financial planning is about people, not Excel spreadsheets. It's understanding that financial planning is dynamic, not throw it into an algorithm and have it spit out the answer and be done with it. It's dynamic and ongoing.
I was journaling on this weekend, Rick, I was following the thread back in my evolution. I have a lot of certifications after my name. Most of them I got in my 20s and 30s because I felt the pressure to know and to be right so I could perform for my client in planning. And so I was approaching my craft as I just need to be smarter so I can solve it and be right for my client. And I had this aha moment of, this is a fool's errand. I'm always going to be wrong. And the pressure from trying to solve something that's unsolvable was really taking a toll on me personally. And my aha moment was, if I can't solve it because it's unknowable, I better start thinking about how do I manage as life unfolds and how do I improve my decision making. That's what led me down the agile methodology. Is I better think about systems. I didn't even use the word systems because I didn't know that word from a area of study, to focus on things I can actually control. It was a pivotal moment, not just in my career, but in my life. And I think it's important for people that are planning for retirement.
Yeah. The key features of complex systems is that they are not predictable, whereas complicated systems are 100% predictable. Well, I hate to tell you, if you or any of your clients have truly mastered the markets and believe that they are complicated, then I say, what the heck are they doing, sitting here listening to this? Because they should be out making $1 trillion. Because, hey, if you tell me what the market's going to do tomorrow, I'll be able to make $1 trillion tomorrow.
I think even in retirement planning, because in retirement planning, most are not concerned about accumulating more. They're looking at, I would call the complex system of a comment you used of utility through time, of how do I harvest this knowing that these outside forces could impact my life, inflation, sequence return, et cetera, but also the internal variables of change in preferences, life circumstance, health events, things that you can't predict. That's complex as well, I would assume.
Yeah, absolutely. In finance, we talk a lot about maximizing utility, but we almost always immediately put that into maximize wealth. In other words, we go from maximize utility to maximize utility of wealth to maximize wealth. My career, I willingly took an 80% cut in pay and a 90% cut in pay. And you might call me I've got letters behind my name as well for professional certifications in finance. You might say, how can someone, in the finance field do something so irrational and stupid? Well, utility is in my simplistic view, is happiness. It's freedom, it's flexibility. And so first off, it's to focus on utility, but that utility, what makes us happy or, what gives us joy, that changes very much through time.
You know what's interesting about that, Rick? Before you go on, I want to pull that thread real quickly, because that is a struggle people have when they're considering retiring, is that they're retiring at the top of their game and they're leaving a lot of money on the table. And they're so used to thinking about utility as accumulation or more wealth that it's difficult, sometimes impossible, for them to reframe it.
Yeah, I'll give an example. When I quote unquote, downsized big time, a lot of people thought I was completely nuts. And, I'll be quite honest. There's a couple days I thought I was completely nuts. In fact, 20 years later, most people still think I'm completely nuts. But the thing is I got to see all of my daughter's rugby games except one. I got to travel the world other than just financial centers. I basically got to design almost every single day of my life. And while I had obligations, I had almost complete flexibility. So, what's the value of seeing your daughter's rugby games?
Or what's the value of her knowing that you're seeing?
All of those things that come into the equation. My previous life, literally I had a car pick me up at 4:30 a.m. on Monday and, plop me down and in my driveway on, Friday night at, around 8 p.m. By the way, don't get me wrong. There's aspects of that life I absolutely love. But now, of course, my daughters are now older and, go to see the rugby games isn't the big thing. But other things have replaced it. And it's thinking about utility. In my view, money is solely 100% a tool. I realize that for some people, they might like to, have a room or lust after a room filled with money that they go swimming in and, rub all over their body,
Okay,
whatever.
That's
But for me, money is solely a tool to allow you to do the things that you could do, that you want to do if you had complete 100% freedom.
And I would imagine the key there is the intentionality of defining what utility is for you in your life.
And that is complex. Unless you are the most simplistic person in the world, unless you are a complete knob, you are not an algorithm. You do not run by rules, laws, and axioms like a complicated person does. You are a function of those you love, of those you don't love, that you surround yourselves with. How many retirements have been brought on by coworkers? The environment of your peers at your social club, at your church, in your neighborhood. These are all factors that, whether you realize it or not, come into your utility and, I would argue, into your opinions about wealth and financial planning.
And that's also on a continuum that changes over time as you're
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
So how does one approach complex problems?
The first thing is to recognize what's complex and what's not. Okay. My first law of risk management is the mere fact that you acknowledge a risk exists automatically improves your management of it. The mere fact that you recognize that something is complex, we just kind of touched upon what's complex versus what's complicated. I know a good book that explains it. But once you recognize that things are complex, I think that automatically improves the situation greatly. The second thing is to think, manage, not solve. You don't solve a complex problem. You don't solve your financial planning. Two more steps I'd like to explain. One is to do a try, learn, adapt approach. Okay. We don't have all the answers in finance, but adopting a try, learn, adapt approach is a very good thing. And kind of the experts at this are ants. Okay, now I don't study ants, but in studying complex systems, you're kind of forced to study ants because ants are kind of the species that has mastered complexity the most. And we all learned that an ant colony has ants that go out and forage for food and they drop pheromone trails, yada, yada, yada. What we might not have learned in junior high is ants also have ants that do nothing but fix the colony when it gets compromised, fix the nest when it gets compromised. There's ants that do nothing but take out the dad, okay? But an ant colony, and there's soldiers, ants, and ants that do other very specific tasks. But what most people don't know is ant colonies also have ants whose job is to do nothing but random stuff. Now, here's the interesting thing. You can take away the soldier ants, the ant colony will survive. You can take away the ants that forage for food, the ant colony will survive. You can take away the ants that reconstruct the nest. By the way, this is according to ant experts, not me. But here's the thing. If you take away the ants that do random stuff, the ant colony very quickly dies. So the lesson from that is you've got to try and you got to learn. And you got to adapt. You have to be brave enough to say, this might work, let's see. And that's something that a complicated thinker has a very, very, very hard time with. That's something who's been in a very strict top-down hierarchical organization has a very difficult time adapting to. But, it's kind of actually one of the secrets of complexity. Make small experiments.
The way I think this presents itself in retirement planning is the top-down approach of taking the spreadsheets and the financial models and that work relatively well for accumulation, you might argue, and applying them to decumulation, where there's a lot more going on there. And the way it will manifest itself is the 4% withdrawal rule or brackets, which is trying to use a complicated approach to solve a complex problem and force a life to fit into a box.
I was going to agree with you and add, in finance, it's not complicated or complex. There's elements of both in it. Well, for example, taxes are complicated. And so if you understand that taxes are complicated, then you throw the algorithms at it. You throw the expert advice at it. And, some of the things that you mentioned, like the 4% rule, I hate to tell you, the mathematics of money are the mathematics of money, it runs by.
But it's a part of a bigger project. Yeah, it's not exactly the project.
And so, separate out the complicated thinking for the stuff that's complicated and the complex thinking for the stuff that's complex. That's what I meant by recognize what type of a system that you're in. And you're exactly right.
So the utility player and having the agility, the other thing that came to mind as you were saying that, Rick, is one of my favorite quotes by Phil Stutz, which is, you'll never be exonerated in life from uncertainty, pain, or the need to do work, which is essentially what we're talking about here. We're always going to have uncertainty. We're going to always have to work to manage it. And it's going to be really hard sometimes. You're never going to be exonerated from that, which essentially is talking about the complex problem of life.
I get up every morning and, give thanks for uncertainty, because if life was completely certain, I wouldn't have a job as for 90% of what I do, because I'd be replaced by a computer by this afternoon. B, it would be pretty darn boring. It is what it is. And
so in how to manage it, obviously realize it. That way you can decrease your frustration and stress because you realize it's not solvable. So what are some other steps that you can take when you realize that the large project is complex in order to feel like you have some agency and a hand on the direction of things?
There's 1,001 small things. I think the main thing is, when I do this in a corporate setting, when I talk about this in the corporate setting, I talk a lot about humility and self-esteem. Okay? I talk about humility, self-esteem, and empathy, actually. Empathy probably doesn't play as large a role in the financial realm. But having the self-esteem to say, I don't know, is very, 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 very powerful. And actually, if you just take a deep breath and realize, shoot, even the best have significant issues with this. That in itself, but also having your self-esteem to say, hey, guess what? Regardless what happens, I will survive. regardless of a mistake or two, I will survive. In the financial planning industry, now, first off, I always think as looking at the financial planning industry, it's always interesting. I'm a huge fan of college football. I watch less professional football. But just as an experiment, watch the advertisements for financial planning on a Saturday versus on a Sunday. The financial planning companies have it down pat because the demographics of the two are actually quite different. Okay? And what you'll see on Saturdays, you'll see pictures of people with their grandkids. And the advertisements are all about the utility of wealth. On Sunday, the demographic is generally younger, and it's all about greed or don't mess up. Very, 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 very different. Seriously, you laugh. Take a look at the series of the most popular finance commercials that run on the 2 days. That's kind of the difference I'm talking about with humility. Okay? On Saturday, you're content to walk down the beach with the companies obviously want you to think of as one of your grandkids or the next generation, yada, yada, yada. And you're content in that. Whereas on Sunday, the focus is on, don't lose 2.2% investing with XYZ discount brand, but save it investing with us, and you'll have, and they literally give you the number to the dollar of the difference that you'd have if you invest with brand X discount website versus brand Y discount website. The emphasis is on being wrong, and on the other, it's on being content. And that, I think, is the difference between complexity thinking and complicate thinking, and between humility and panic.
So when I think of retirement planning, I use the example of someone that goes to the gym. If we're in the accumulation mode for decades, decades of accumulating and that build more, when you get closer into retirement, if you're not thinking about this already, and maybe you should, the whole game changes because you're going to Saturday and about the utility of time, and you're going to decumulation and harvesting rather than sowing, and understanding that you're making that change. If you don't, you'll continue on with one mindset and have a mismatch between process versus what you're actually trying to solve for.
Yeah, but again, this also gets back to the utility versus time thing as well. Okay? We focus so much on the dollar amounts at various points in time. But, the reality is going to see a $20 rock concert for me back when I was, in my early 20s, and now I'm dating myself because when the heck was a concert ever $20? Okay? Actually has, in my mind anyway, a lot more value than the $400 that the equivalent ticket would cost today after the inflation adjusted. And, as we go through our life cycle, I've always been interested in demographics. And I got into demographics actually when I was in graduate school. David Fruit, who's a famous demographer, wrote the book Boom, Bust, and Echo, spoke to the PhD students, and it was very illuminating. And I started to think about, well, okay, right now I'm in my 20s. How am I going to feel about this when I'm in my 40s and, my kids are going off to university in 2 to 3 years? And then how am I going to feel about it as I now start into my 60s? And that focus on utility and the different points of utility through time. First off, I was totally wrong in how I would think about it. But having said that, I was way more right than simply going with the algorithm that he with the most money in the investment account at the end wins.
I was thinking of Richard Ury, the gentleman, the negotiator. I heard an interview with him recently, and he talks about you have to have the ability to go to the balcony, he calls it, and get perspective to observe. I didn't ask you about this before, but I'm curious. One as I've worked on fleshing out the agile process as it relates to retirement planning, one of the things I think is important, and maybe you would disagree, is since we're managing things and there's money, optionality seems to be very undervalued. Everybody's focused on optimizing, which, in my mind, if you try to optimize, especially financially, you can end up making things a little bit brittle. So when things go differently than you expected, it can break a lot easier. And as a result, I think having more buffer in the system when you're managing complexity would make sense.
Well, first off, hey, full disclosure, I'm a former administrator, so of course, I'm key on that. I'm a firm believer in optionality. I'm a firm believer, no pun intended, that options are valuable, and I don't just mean financial options. A lot of people who look at complexity think that agile thinking is the be-all and end-all answer to complex situations, and it's not. But it is certainly compatible and consistent with complexity thinking. And obviously, flexibility is huge. Optionality is huge. Never exercising your options early. And again, I don't necessarily mean just financial options. All of those, I firmly believe, are key elements of not only a sound financial plan, but a sound life planning. Period. Full stop. End of story.
The last thing I wanted to hit on briefly, because I know you're doing research on this, and this is an area that I have not opened the Pandora's box to, I've danced around the edges, is artificial intelligence and AI, and how that will play, whether it's going to exacerbate the differences or maybe it makes complex problems more complicated. What is your initial, or wherever you're at in your thinking on how AI plays into this discussion about complex versus complicated in systems?
Yeah, I actually go one step a little farther. It's actually digitization and AI. Okay. Take my former profession of being a administrator. As a profession, that's almost been completely decimated by digitization and AI. And it's not really sophisticated AI. Back when I worked in derivatives, virtually everyone had a PhD, or each desk had an army of PhDs. Now, someone who wants to spend 5 minutes on the web with AI can download all the tools that we had and more in a much more sophisticated way. And so that industry has been decimated. I only learned 3 things in getting my MBA and my PhD in finance. I'm actually a physicist by training. And one of them is just when you think it's a trend, you find out it's a cycle. So what AI is doing is it is completely decimating, from my viewpoint, the financial industry. I've spoken at 4 major industry conferences this year, basically on this.
I'm sure you're really popular.
Well, yeah, for this talk that they asked me to come in, I always have to put my running shoes on, which, if you saw how big I am, is a bit of a comical oxymoron. But anyhow, it's fundamentally changing finance careers, not only in hardcore, not only in financial management, but in financial planning. And we see this. Everyone's going to their phone for their financial planning, and AI is in essence crowding out a lot of finance professionals. As a finance professor, of course, I have a lot of students who want to go into a finance career, and they have to totally think about it. Ironically, and here I'll get in trouble, but I'm on sabbatical, so hopefully everyone will forget about it before I go back. But in university finance, we are, in my opinion, so far, we're like 40 years out of date. We're so far behind the 8 ball in how we're preparing students for this. So AI is crushing the jobs, but ironically, what it's doing is crowding out all the complicated thinkers. But what's left is the complexity thinkers. And for that, we need humans. I'm working with one of the major AI companies on basically building AI to recognize what's complex so it doesn't try to deal with it. Because by definition, AI cannot deal with complexity. Now, a lot of our issues, if we go into our financial planning, for instance, with a with a complicated mindset, thinking that there's a solution, guess what? My phone's going to give you a better solution than any financial planner. Now, is it going to be a good solution? Hey, there's no saying in risk management, it's far better to be approximately right than precisely wrong. Well, this is going to give you something that's very precise. But getting back to your optionality, it's probably also going to be precisely wrong. So what this means is AI is actually, very ironically, creating a space for human financial planners who can think, who can understand, who have empathy.
A phrase I've said for years is, I can Google knowledge, I can't Google wisdom, in that human judgment.
But it's the empathy that's even more key. Okay, I'm fully with you on the judgment. Okay, fully with you on the judgment. But it's the empathy that's even more key, and it's the sociological imagination, which is probably something that we don't want to go into. But I encourage your listeners to watch the video, which is available easily. A YouTube search will give to $1 Trillion Bet, which was about long-term capital management, which of course had 2 Nobel Prize winners, had the best of the best.
Wonderful book.
Yeah,
wonderful
and the video,
book. That book was When Genius Failed, I think, Roger Lowenstein.
Yeah, When Genius Failed. Yeah.
$1 Trillion Bet. I haven't seen the video.
Yeah, the video, it's a Nova special. If you go on the Nova website, it's there. If you go on YouTube, it's there. And here you literally have, the brightest people in the room who failed spectacularly. One, because they didn't have, for a lot of reasons, but in terms of complicated thinking, they were the creme de la creme, okay? But they didn't understand complexity. They didn't have a sociological imagination. They didn't have empathy. They didn't have humility. And another interesting side view to this, another video that's widely available, is Fog of War. For those of your clients who remember Robert McNamara, who was a hero in World War II for his complicated thinking, but when he became Secretary of Defense under Kennedy, and then later during the Vietnam War, of course, he wrote a very powerful book, which was made into a documentary called Fog of War, both the book and the documentary. And again, he describes how his complicated thinking led him astray and complexity.
I'll have to check the book out. One study I read related to this, and we don't have to pull this thread too hard, is years ago, it was by the CIA looking at analysts and the quality of their analysis. And one of the conclusions of the paper was that the smarter you are, the quicker you are to judgment, and the quicker you are to filter information for confirming what you've already decided, which essentially kills curiosity.
But there's also another aspect of that, which is the Dunning-Krueger effect. The Dunning-Krueger effect is basically this very U-shaped or very humped curve, where basically at one end of the spectrum, you are so uninformed that you don't know how uninformed you are. And these are the people who think that they would make great Formula One race car drivers, et cetera, who've never been in a race car in their entire life. Basically, they're idiots. But at the other end of the scale, we see that the people who are truly considered to be the creme de la creme in terms of wisdom, they actually massively underestimate their ability and wisdom. So it's only the mediocre people. And by the way, someone who speaks frequently in the media and then gets screamed at for it, I see this all the time. What the media wants and what society wants is they want the complicated thinker. They'll tell us inflation next year is going to be 2.9769432, and Powell's going to lower the rate to this exact amount on this exact thing. And they look really professional, and they have nicely combed hair. And that's what sells in media, and that's what sells in real life. But it doesn't work in real life. And so again, would you rather be precisely wrong or approximately right?
I think that is a great way to end this discussion, which is, I think, critical to retirement planning if we're focused on the utility of life over time. Dr. Nason, thanks for hanging out with me.
Roger, it's been a lot of fun. I've enjoyed our discussion. Take care.